The night before my son's wedding, my own sister pulled me aside and said 5 words I still hear every morning when I wake up. "Nobody wants you there, Carl." I drove home alone. I ironed my suit anyway and hung it on the door, and by noon the next day the wedding was finished before it ever started. What came out after that changed everything, including what I thought I knew about the only family I had left. My name is Carl Norris. I'm 57 years old. I live in Queens, New York. I was a union electrician for 22 years until a disc blew out on a job site in 2016 and took my career with it. After that, I picked up handyman work, small electrical consulting, whatever kept the bills paid. Nothing glamorous, but I kept the lights on. That's what I always did. My wife, Sandra, passed when our son Nate was 4 years old. Brain aneurysm. No warning. She went to bed one night and didn't wake up. I was 32. Nate was too young to understand what happened. He just kept asking when Mom was coming home. I didn't have an answer for him. I just kept showing up every morning and figuring it out one day at a time. So it was the two of us after that. Me and Nate in a 2-bedroom apartment in Flushing. I won't pretend it was some perfect father-son story. I missed school events because I was on a job. I burned dinner more nights than I can count. There were stretches where the money was tight enough that I was doing math at the grocery store, putting things back. But I was there. Every morning, every weekend, every time he needed me, I was there. That's the only thing I know how to be. Nate turned into a good man. Better than I had any right to expect, honestly. He worked hard all through school, got into law school on loans and stubbornness, and his goal was never the big salary. He told me once, sitting at the same kitchen table we'd eaten at his whole life, "Dad, I want to help people who can't afford to fight for themselves." I didn't say much back. I'm not that kind of man, but I thought about that sentence for a long time after he said it. 3 years ago, he brought home Tammy Voss. She was sharp, good-looking, put together, the kind of woman who seems to have everything figured out before she walks into the room. Nate was clearly gone for her, head over heels. I could see it every time he looked at her, and I wanted to be happy for him. I tried, but something sat wrong with me from the first dinner. She was polite enough, said the right things, laughed at the right moments, but there was something underneath it that felt like a performance. She never asked about Nate's childhood, never asked about Sandra, which I understood, but never asked about how we managed, what it was like, any of it. She wasn't interested in where Nate came from, only in where he was going, and every conversation, no matter where it started, eventually found its way to money. Not in an obvious way, more like water finding a drain. She'd talk about neighborhoods, and it would come around to what Nate would be earning in 5 years. She'd talk about the future, and it would land on what partners at mid-size firms make. She once sat at my kitchen table and told me with a straight face that Nate's pro bono work was admirable but not sustainable long-term, like his values were a budgeting problem she was working on. I kept my mouth shut. It wasn't my life to run. What I did do was build something. A few weeks before the wedding, I spent several evenings in my garage putting together a small wooden box, nothing fancy. Sanded it smooth, put a simple latch on it. Inside, I put Nate's first Little League card. A photo of the two of us up at Lake George when he was 9, him holding a fish that was honestly too small to keep, but he was so proud of it, we took the picture anyway. And a copy of a note he'd left on the refrigerator the morning he left for college. Just 5 words, "Thanks, Dad, for everything." I had kept the original folded in my wallet for 11 years. I made a copy so he could have it. I drove to the rehearsal dinner venue the evening before the wedding to drop it off before the crowd showed up. That's when I ran into Diane. My sister is 50 years old. She works at a bank in White Plains. We were never especially close growing up, the kind of siblings who got along fine but didn't have much in common. After Sandra died, she came around more. Helped with Nate sometimes on weekends when I had long jobs. I was grateful for that. I trusted her the way you trust someone who's been quietly reliable for years. She was already at the venue when I pulled up, standing near the entrance with Tammy. The two of them together stopped talking when they saw me coming across the parking lot. Diane walked toward me before I reached the door. "Carl," she said, lowering her voice. "Can I talk to you for a second?" The way she said it told me this wasn't small talk. She pulled me a few steps away, toward the side of the building, out of earshot from the people coming in and out. Then she told me carefully, like she'd been thinking about how to say it, that Tammy had spoken to her earlier that day, that Tammy had concerns about the wedding, about how things might go with me there. About tension. I stood there holding that wooden box and looked at my sister. "She told you to tell me not to come," I said. Diane didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She said she was just passing on what she'd heard, that she thought for Nate's sake, maybe I should give them the day. Let them have it without any complications. "Did Nate say that?" I asked. "Did Nate tell you he doesn't want me there?" She looked off to the side. Tammy speaks for both of them now. I stood there another few seconds, then I walked back to my truck and put the wooden box on the passenger seat and drove home. That night I hung my suit on the door anyway, I shined my shoes, I set the alarm for 7. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and thought about what Diane had said and what she hadn't said. By midnight, I reached over and turned the alarm off. I was not going to walk into that church uninvited. If my own sister was standing at that door telling me I was the problem, something was already broken. And I wasn't going to perform my way through it for the sake of appearances. The morning of the wedding, I stayed in my work clothes, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table where Nate and I had eaten breakfast together for 25 years. The chair across from me was empty the way it always was now, but that morning it felt different. It felt like something final. I watched the clock move from 7 to 8 to 9. At some point, I pulled out my phone and found a video from Nate's 10th birthday. He was trying to blow out all the candles on his cake at once and kept missing the one in the back corner. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world. He kept laughing so hard he couldn't get enough air to blow. Sandra's voice was on the video, off camera, laughing along with him. I had watched that video probably 200 times over the years. I watched it twice that morning. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the street. The text started coming in around 9. Cousins asking where I was. A neighbor who was going to the ceremony asking if I needed a ride. I left them all unanswered. Then a voicemail from Nate, his voice tightened the way it gets when he's trying to stay calm. Dad, everyone's asking where you are. Call me back, please. I listened to it once and set the phone down again. Lorraine called at 9:40. Lorraine had known me since I was doing electrical work in her office building back in the early 2000s. She had done legal assistant work for years and had a way of understanding contracts and paperwork that most people without a law degree do not have. She knew how to read the fine print. She was at the venue with the other guests, already seated, when she stepped outside to call me. "Carl, you're not here," she said. "Talk to me. I'm sitting this one out," I said. A pause. "Who told you to do that?" "Diane." The pause this time was longer. "Stay by your phone," she said. "I need to look at something." She called back 22 minutes later. The ceremony was scheduled to start in less than an hour. Her voice had dropped, the way people talk when they do not want to be overheard. "I got to look at the prenup agreement this morning," she said. Marvin Voss had a copy in his jacket and left it on a chair in the side room. "I read it, Carl. You need to hear this." I told her to go ahead. She explained it plain, without the legal language. Marvin Voss, Tammy's father, had drafted the prenup. Inside it was a clause that required 75% of Nate's income to be deposited into a joint account controlled by both Tammy and her father for the first 5 years of the marriage. If the marriage ended within that window, those funds would transfer outright to the Voss family. No split, no negotiation. Gone. I sat there and let that settle. "Marvin Voss has been bankrupt for almost a decade," Lorraine said. 2 failed businesses. Creditors have been after him for years. This wedding was never about Tammy loving your son. It was about attaching Marvin's debt problem to Nate's career before Nate had enough experience to know what he was signing. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked the question that had already formed in the back of my mind: who witnessed the prenup? Lorraine went quiet for just a second, long enough for me to know the answer before she said it. "Diane," she said. "Her signature is right there on the page." I put my hand flat on the kitchen table and stared at the wood grain. My sister had known what was in that document. She had sat down and signed her name to it, and then she had come to that rehearsal dinner and stood at that door and told me I was the one who did not belong. I thought about every time Diane had been around the past year. How often she and Tammy had been together, dinners I had not been invited to. A weekend trip to the Catskills that Diane mentioned once and never brought up again. I had not connected any of it because I had no reason to. She was my sister. That was reason enough to trust her. I asked Lorraine what she thought I should do. "Right now, nothing," she said. "Something is already happening at the church. Let me call you back." I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and stood at the window. Down on the street, a neighbor was loading his kids into a car, the kids still in their pajamas arguing about something. Normal Saturday, nothing unusual about any of it from the outside. Inside that kitchen, everything had shifted. I had spent 25 years building something. Not a business, not a reputation, not anything you could put a number on. I had built a son. I had gotten up every single morning when it would have been easier not to. I had worked jobs that broke my body so that Nate would never have to choose between paying rent and doing the right thing. I had made sure he knew that doing the right thing mattered, even when it cost you something. And somewhere along the way, while I was focused on all of that, someone had been quietly working to take the result of all of it and use it to cover someone else's failures. Lorraine called back 14 minutes later. Her voice was different this time, not careful anymore. "Urgent. Carl," she said. "The wedding is not happening. You need to hear what just happened inside that church." What Lorraine told me came out in pieces, the way things do when someone is standing in a parking lot trying to keep their voice down while half the guests are filing out around them. Nate's closest friend since high school is Floyd. They grew up 2 blocks apart, played ball together, stayed close through college and law school even when they were in different cities. Floyd is the kind of guy who does not overthink things. He sees something wrong. He says something. That morning, about 40 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, Floyd received a message on his phone from a woman who lived in Tammy's building. The woman had watched the engagement unfold over the past year. She had seen things she did not feel right staying quiet about. The message she sent Floyd contained photographs. Tammy, 2 weeks before the wedding, with a man who was not Nate, her supervisor at the marketing firm where she worked. The photos were not ambiguous. This was not 2 colleagues having lunch. Floyd walked into the room where Nate was getting dressed and handed him the phone without saying a word. Lorraine said the guests in the pews started noticing something was wrong around 10:50. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 11. The bridal party had not come out. The pastor was standing at the front, looking toward the side door. People were checking their phones, whispering to each other. After about 15 minutes of that, Nate walked out, not with Tammy, alone. He stood at the front of that church in his wedding suit and looked out at 80 people he had known most of his life. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He said there would be no wedding today, that he was sorry for the inconvenience, and that he appreciated everyone coming. Then he walked back down the aisle and out the side door. Lorraine said the sanctuary went completely silent for about 5 seconds, then Marvin Voss stood up. Marvin was not quiet about it. He started talking about embarrassment and reputation and what this would do to his daughter. His wife started crying loudly enough that people 3 rows back could hear her. Tammy came out of the bridal suite and went after Nate through the parking lot, still in her dress, calling his name. The pastor tried to say something calming into the microphone. Nobody was listening. I sat in my kitchen listening to all of this through the phone and did not say much. When Lorraine finished, I asked where Nate was. "He left," she said. "I think he's coming to you." 20 minutes later, I heard his truck in the driveway. He came in still wearing the suit. He sat down at the kitchen table in the same chair he had sat in his whole life and put his phone face down on the table. I poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. Neither of us said anything for a little while. Then he told me about the photos, about Floyd handing him the phone, about standing there in that side room, looking at pictures of the woman he was about to marry with someone else 2 weeks before the wedding. He said it was not the anger that hit him first. It was the recognition, the feeling of things he had brushed off suddenly making sense, the late nights at the office, the way she changed when she talked to her supervisor on the phone, the times he had almost said something and then told himself he was reading too much into it. He said, "I should have listened to that feeling a long time ago. I let him talk. That is something I learned when he was a teenager. When Nate needs to work something out, he needs to say it out loud first. You do not help him by jumping in." When he went quiet, I told him there was something else he needed to know. I told him about Lorraine's call, about the prenup. I laid it out the same way she had laid it out to me, plain and without the legal terms. 75% of his income for 5 years into an account controlled by Tammy and her father. A transfer clause that handed all of it to the Voss family if the marriage ended inside that window. A father-in-law who had been drowning in debt for nearly a decade and saw Nate's law career as the way out. Nate listened without interrupting. His face went through a few different things while I talked. By the time I finished, he was just still. "I read that prenup," he said quietly. "I read it and I signed it." "Did you read all of it?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. I read what she pointed me to. That right there told me everything I needed to know about how carefully this had been set up. Then I told him about Diane. I told him her name was on the witness line, that she had signed that document knowing what was in it, that she had been meeting with Marvin Voss's financial consultant in the months leading up to the wedding, and that I had not known any of it until that morning. Nate looked at me across the table. "She told you not to come to my wedding," he said. "Yes." He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. Outside, a car went past on the street. A dog barked somewhere down the block, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday going on like nothing had happened. "What do we do?" he asked. I told him we did not do anything today. Today he went home, got out of that suit, and slept. Tomorrow we would start figuring out what came next, because the way I saw it, we had time on our side. The people who had put this together thought they had won. They thought Nate had signed that prenup, the wedding had happened, and everything was in place. They did not know yet that any of it had come apart. And that gap, that window where they still thought they were ahead, was exactly where we needed to work. Nate nodded slowly. He trusted me the way he always had, not because I always had the answers, but because I had never once steered him wrong on purpose. We sat there a while longer without talking. That was enough for now. The week after the wedding that never happened was quiet in the way that feels wrong. Not peaceful, just empty. Nate threw himself into work. He had started at a small firm in Manhattan 2 months earlier, splitting his time between contract law and pro bono cases. He told me he needed to stay busy, and I understood that. When things fall apart, some men drink, some men disappear. Nate works. He got that from me. I spent that week making calls and pulling things together. Lorraine connected me with a colleague of hers, a licensed attorney named Phil who handled civil cases and knew financial fraud when he saw it. I brought him everything I had. The prenup document Lorraine had photographed at the church, the Voss family bankruptcy filings going back 9 years, which Phil pulled from public records in about 40 minutes. A chain of emails Nate had forwarded to me after the confrontation at the church, emails between Tammy and her father that Nate had found on a shared tablet they used at the apartment. In those emails, Marvin Voss referred to the marriage plainly as the arrangement and mentioned Diane by name in 2 separate messages, thanking her for staying on board. Phil read through everything at his desk and then leaned back in his chair. "Your sister didn't commit a crime," he said. "Witnessing a document isn't illegal, even if the document itself is predatory. But what this shows is a coordinated effort to isolate you and get Nate to sign something that would have drained his income for 5 years to cover another family's debt. That's the story here." I asked him what we could actually do with it. "A few things," he said. "First, the prenup is void. Nate never signed the final version after the confrontation. And even if he had, a court would likely throw out Clause 14 as unconscionable. Second, Marvin Voss still has creditors. If we share what we know with the right people, his financial situation gets considerably more complicated. Third, Diane's involvement needs to be addressed, not legally but personally. That's your call." I told him I understood. I asked him to move forward on the first 2. What I hadn't decided yet was what to do about Diane. She called me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was short, her voice careful and flat, saying she thought we should talk. The second was longer. She said she understood I was upset. She said things were more complicated than they appeared. She said she had her own reasons for the decisions she made and that she hoped I would give her a chance to explain. I listened to both messages once and did not call her back. On the 9th day after the wedding, Diane sent a text saying she was organizing a family dinner at the house our parents had left us jointly. The house in Bayside that we had been splitting the carrying costs on for 6 years while we figured out what to do with it. She framed it as a chance to clear the air. She invited me, Nate, 2 cousins from our mother's side, and an uncle who was in from New Jersey. I showed the text to Phil. He told me to go. "Let her set the table," he said. "Then you put down what you have." I called Nate that evening. He was quiet on the phone for a moment after I explained the plan. "I'll be there," he said. The dinner was on a Saturday. I drove out to Bayside alone. The house looked the same as it always had. The aluminum siding my father had put up in 1987, the front steps that always creaked on the left side. I had grown up in that house. So had Diane. We had carried our mother out of that house in a wheelchair the last year of her life and then carried our father out 2 years after that. There was a lot of history in those walls, not all of it good, but it was ours. Diane opened the door. She looked tired. She had the table set with the good dishes, the ones our mother saved for holidays. The cousins were already seated. The uncle was in the living room watching the news. Nate's car pulled up right behind mine. Diane hugged Nate at the door. He didn't say much. We sat down. Diana had made pot roast, the same recipe our mother used. She passed the bread and asked about the cousins' kids and kept things light for the first 20 minutes. The uncle talked about a fishing trip. One cousin talked about a renovation he was doing on his garage. Normal Saturday family dinner sounds. Then Diane set down her fork and looked at me. "Carl," she said, "I think it's time we talked about everything." I agreed with her on that. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the folder I had carried in with me. I set it on the table next to the breadbasket. Everyone at the table looked at it. I opened it and laid out the documents one at a time. The prenup, Clause 14 with the 75% provision highlighted. The bankruptcy filings for Marvin Voss going back to 2015. And last, printed on plain paper, the 2 emails where Marvin thanked Diane by name for staying on board with the arrangement. The table went quiet. Diane stared at the papers. Her face moved through several things quickly. "That's not what those emails mean," she said. "Then tell me what they mean," I said. She looked at Nate. He was watching her with his hands flat on the table, not angry, just waiting. He had that same quality his mother used to have, the ability to go completely still when it mattered. I was trying to help, Diane said. Her voice had changed. Smaller now, Marvin told me Tammy and Nate were solid. He said the prenup was standard. He said you were the one making things difficult, and that if you stayed involved, you would push Nate away from Tammy and ruin everything. And you believed that, I said. She didn't answer. You signed that document, Diane. You told me to stay home, and the whole time you knew what was in those pages. The uncle had put down his fork. The cousins were not looking at anyone. Nate spoke quietly from across the table. Aunt Diane, did they offer you something? For staying on board like the email says. Diane's jaw tightened. She looked down at the tablecloth. That was answer enough. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The pot roast was getting cold. The uncle picked up his water glass and put it back down without drinking. One of the cousins was looking at the window like he was thinking about leaving. Diane finally spoke. Her voice was flat. Marvin said, if the marriage went through and stayed together for 3 years, I would get first rights to buy out Carl's share of this house at the 2019 assessed value. She said it like a confession she had rehearsed. Like if she said it plainly enough, it would sound less like what it was. The 2019 assessed value was $340,000 below what the house was worth now, which meant she had been promised the chance to buy me out at a price that would have cost me close to that amount in equity. While smiling at my kitchen table, while telling me I was the one making things complicated, Nate put both hands on the table and stood up slowly. He looked at Diane for a long moment without saying anything. Then he walked to the front door, picked up his jacket from the hook where he had always hung it since he was a kid, and stepped outside. I gathered the documents back into the folder. I nodded at the cousins. I thanked the uncle for coming. Then I walked out after Nate. He was standing on the front steps, the ones that always creak on the left side. He was looking out at the street. I stood next to him and didn't say anything for a minute. She was going to let them take it, he said, not angry. Just stating it. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. And tell you to stay home so you wouldn't find out until it was too late. That's about the size of it, I said. We stood there on those steps for another minute. A car went by. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Normal neighborhood sounds. Then Nate said, I'm sorry, Dad. I looked at him. You didn't do anything wrong. I should have seen it sooner. She was careful, I said. People who plan things out like that are usually careful. He didn't answer. I didn't push it. The legal process ran for several months after that. Phil filed the paperwork to formally void the prenup, which went through without much resistance since Nate had never signed the final version. The documentation we had compiled on Marvin Voss went to 2 of his creditors through Phil's contacts. Within 6 weeks, Marvin was dealing with renewed collection actions on debts he had been sitting on for years. The plan he had built around his daughter's marriage collapsed the same way his businesses had, quietly, and then all at once. Diane and I went through a mediation process over the house. A neutral attorney reviewed everything. In the end, she retained her half share, but the agreement she had made with Marvin was ruled unenforceable since it had been based on outcomes that never occurred. She called me once during that process, left a voicemail saying she never meant for things to go this far. I did not call back. Some things you cannot talk your way out of. Tammy's social media went quiet after a few weeks. She had posted a few things in the days right after the canceled wedding, vague and pointed at the same time, the kind of posts that want sympathy without saying enough to be argued with. They stopped. I don't know what she's doing now, and I don't think about it much. What I do think about more than I expected to is the prenup itself. That piece of paper. Someone sat down and wrote it, went clause by clause, and decided that a young man who had worked his whole life to build something decent was a resource to be accessed. Not a person, not someone's son, just a number attached to a future salary. And then they found someone close enough to me to help them get the door open. I think about that sometimes when I'm on a job, running conduit, or tracing a wire that's been giving somebody trouble. There's a kind of work where you have to understand the whole system before you touch anything. You can't just fix the part that's sparking. You have to trace it back to the source. That's what this whole thing was. Tracing it back. Nate comes over most Sundays now. Sometimes we watch football, sometimes we don't. A few weeks after the mediation closed, he drove out on a Saturday and we spent the afternoon replacing a section of fence along the back of my yard that had been rotting for 2 years. We pulled the old posts, set new ones, mixed the concrete, ran the rails. Didn't talk a lot. When we finished, he stood back and looked at it. Straight, he said. Straight, I said. He said he'd come back the following Saturday, and I told him I'd have the coffee ready. That was enough for me. If you're watching this and something in this story feels familiar, maybe you've been told you're the problem when you weren't. Maybe someone used your trust against you, or you've watched a person you built your life around get pulled in a direction that never made sense. I want you to know that staying quiet and staying patient is not the same as being weak. And when the time comes to put the documents on the table, you put them on the table. You don't have to raise your voice, you just have to be ready. That's all any of us can do.